I'm Lisa, the artist behind Lachri Fine Art. Today I'm going to do a tutorial for you guys on painting wood grain of a shelf. For this piece I went with a Fredrix Blue Label Ultra Smooth Canvas because I needed a surface that was going to be really smooth for all of the airbrushing and fine detail work that I was going to be doing. This is going to be a two-part video. Today is just the tutorial of the wood shelf itself, showing you guys how to achieve wood grain. And then next week will be the full time-lapse video including the candles and butterflies. Now these techniques will work for both oil or acrylic. The main difference would be if you're working in oil, whereas I layered everything and then just painted over my background layers. If I were to have done this in oil, I would have drawn directly onto the canvas first where my shelf and butterflies and candles are going to go and just painted around everything. But with acrylic drying so quickly, it was just easier to do my whole background and then layer the shelf on top of that. So that would be the main difference there. If you're going to do oil, I would recommend drawing it out and painting around your subjects versus layering, how I did here. I have new video critiques every Tuesday where I critique your original paintings and drawings. I have my own speed paintings, drawings, and tutorials every Wednesday and vlogs most weekends. So make sure you subscribe and follow me on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, all those social media sites, links below in the video description to keep up with news and my newest work. Now we can get on to the tutorial. Because I'm working up against a dark red background, I'm using a fairly opaque color to get the base of my wood shelf down. I'm using different shades of brown and some white and unbleached titanium white to get this color. I'm not worrying about blending everything out perfectly. I'm leaving some of these streaks, they just need to stay horizontal so they work with the wood grain for later layers. Once I finish getting this layer blocked in, I'm going to use a hairdryer to dry it all and then go on to my next layer. I'm not worrying about completely covering the red in the pattern in the background here because that's just going to add more texture in my finished piece. Now that that's all dry and the canvas is cooled, I can start working on building up my first set of layers. These do not have to be perfect. I'm going to do so many layers on this to get the texture that I want that I'm not worrying about every stroke being absolutely perfect. I'm being very sketchy, and I just want the front end of the shelf to be lighter and the back to be darker so that I can get that depth. I just want a soft fade from the dark shadows in the back to the lighter colors in the foreground, and I'll go back through eventually with airbrush and really darken up that back line, but for now I'm leaving it like this. Once I get the transition that I want from the dark in the back to the light in the foreground, I'm going to dry this layer and then start working on the finer details of the wood grain itself. When you use the hairdryer to dry your painting, I do recommend letting the canvas cool for a few seconds before you start painting, just because acrylic dries so fast as it is, you don't need that additional heat to help you along with that. Now I'm moving on to painting in the actual wood grain. I'm using a small flat brush and I'm keeping my lines very sketchy. The reason for this is that I want my wood shelf to have an aged look, so that kind of splintered wood. That comes out better if I keep my lines very sketchy. If I wanted a smooth, more sanded down, polished wood grain, I would leave my lines more straight and smooth. While you're doing this, make sure you've got either a good reference photo or you've got an actual wood shelf or wood something next to you that you can use as reference for this. You don't want to just do this straight out of your head the first few times that you paint the wood grain. It's best to have something to refer to so that you can see the way that all of the little grainy lines work together. For my initial layers of the wood grain, I am keeping everything with a very high contrast. My lights are really light and my darks are very dark. And the reason for this is I will later go on and glaze this to tone everything down. But for now, it looks better if I keep everything really bold. The first set of lines that I'm putting on here for the wood grain, I'm using a blackish brown mix, and I start with very light lines and then I'm going back through and darkening these up. I'm going to go back through with lighter lines in between, but for now the first set for just building up my initial patterns, I am using that very dark color. I'm using unbleached titanium white to highlight this corner edge. I want to make sure that you can see a difference between the top surface of the shelf and that edge. And because of where my light source is, that needs to be lighter anyway. Now I'm using the unbleached titanium white again to go back through with very sketchy marks to add more texture into the grain that's already there. I'm going in between most of my darker lines. Now normally I hate a dry brush look, like passionately hate the look of a dry brush. But in this case, it actually works to the texture that I'm trying to get. I don't have a lot of water mixed in with this paint. It's pretty dry so that I can keep that sketchy look. If you want your wood shelf or wood grain to look more polished, you will do smoother lines. And in that case, no dry brushing at all. I'm now still using the unbleached titanium white, and I'm really highlighting the edge of this shelf so that it really stands out and gives me that three-dimensional look.
As you're working, if you get a few layers that look terrible and you hate how they look, just keep painting over them. Don't give up on it. The more layers you do for this, some of those are going to show through, even the bad layers, and it just builds up that much more texture. That's why in my earlier layers, I wasn't worried about the red wallpaper showing through a little bit because it was just going to add a little bit more texture to my wood. You can do as many layers as you want here. Just keep building and building and building until you get the look that you like. And if you get to where, like in this case, I'm having too much contrast, which I knew I was going to do because I'm going to glaze over. But if you get to where you have way too much contrast and you think you've done a terrible job and need to start over, don't, because you can just glaze later on, which I will end up showing you, but you can glaze to tone all of that down and then continue building your wood grain until you get it how you like. But don't get frustrated and paint over it and think you need to start over. Just let any of the wood grain that you've built up so far work to your advantage for your later layers. As a general rule, the more layers that you paint, the more depth that you're going to achieve. So it's always good the more you end up with. Now I am starting that glaze to tone everything down where I've got everything too harsh, too much white in there, which I did intentionally. Now I am glazing a burnt umber, I believe this is, over everything. And for a glaze, it's a whole lot of water and a little bit of paint. If you're working in oil, you're going to use your mixing medium, in my case it would be liquid, with a little bit of paint, more liquid than paint, so that it's a very translucent layer. And you can see how now it just brings all of those colors of the lights and the darks together in a much more natural look. And you can do these glazes in several layers. I started with the brown, now I'm glazing black into the background to darken that up even more. And again, I'll go back over this with the airbrush for the finished piece, but I'm just doing more glazing in between. Now, you do want to make sure that when you're glazing that you're letting that paint dry in between glazes. If it's not completely dry, you'll end up lifting up the first few layers. So definitely dry it in between. I'm now glazing some magenta into the shelf so that it looks like it's reflecting some of that wallpaper background. Again, just kind of bringing the whole piece together so that it looks like it's all part of one piece and not just two cut out separate sections. Once those glazes are in, I'm going back through with some unbleached titanium white to bring out a few more highlights, just make those colors pop a little bit more. I'm using the same brush here that I used on my previous layers building up the texture in the wood grain, the smaller flat brush, and I'm still doing very, very sketchy lines. And you can keep building this up. I can go back and highlight a whole lot of areas, and if it's too light, I can go back through and glaze over it and then highlight more. I mean, you can go back and forth and play with that until you get the texture that you like. If you end up with a layer and you think, oh my gosh, I ruined it, I made it way too light, no big deal. Just glaze over it, tone it down, and then go back through and build up again as you want. And you can keep going back and forth this way as many times as you need to achieve the look that you're going for. So as you can see, building up the texture, it looks really cool. It looks like you put tons of time and tons of work into it, but it's a pretty quick process, and it just gives your piece a really nice detailed look. Make sure to head back next week where I will be completing this piece and you can watch the whole progress, including the candles and the butterflies.